Okay.
Sounds good.
Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dornsife webinar series, Emerging Issues in the Coronavirus Pandemic. Today's webinar is entitled, Can We Expect a Vaccine Anytime Soon? My name is Esther Chernak. I'm an associate clinical professor in the Dornsife School of Public Health and the Drexel University College of Medicine. I'm also the director of the Center for Public Health Readiness and Communication at Drexel University, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Today's topic is extremely important as the US and countries around the globe have and continue to rely on social distancing as the primary mechanism to limit transmission of COVID-19. Our current strategy of non-pharmaceutical interventions is challenging to implement, brutal in its impact on our economy, and ultimately only going to be temporizing. However, we are in great need of an effective vaccine to truly limit the spread of this disease and prevent new infections. And the good news is that there are a number of new and very promising approaches to vaccine development in general that will hopefully facilitate the arrival of a COVID-19 vaccine or a set of vaccines soon. So our session today features two terrific guests, both highly esteemed experts in the world of vaccine development and health policy, and I will now introduce each of them. Marian Wentworth is President and Chief Executive Officer of Management Sciences for Health, MSH, a global nonprofit that works side by side with leaders in low and middle income countries to build strong, equitable, and sustainable health systems that save lives and improve health outcomes. Since joining MSH in 2017, Marian is focused on developing a new strategic vision to guide the organization's broad, decades-long technical expertise in addressing evolving challenges in leadership, health systems management, human resources, and access to medicines. Prior to joining MSH, she worked for over 25 years managing and leading complex international public health initiatives at Merck & Company, including leading global strategies for the company's vaccine initiatives, including HPV vaccine Gardasil, adult vaccines including shingles, influenza, pneumococcal vaccine, hepatitis A and B, and tetanus vaccines. Marian also serves on the Value of Vaccination Research Network and on the WHO's Product Development for Vaccines Advisory Committee. She has also worked extensively with Gavi, the World Health Organization, the Gates Foundation, and various ministries of health. Our second guest is Lydia Ogden. Lydia Ogden is a health policy expert and executive and a global health consultant. She has public and private sector experience in predicting and managing health system change, motivating teams to drive results, communicating for impact, and enabling successful health partnerships spanning across the globe. She has a proven track record in recruiting, nurturing, and retaining top talent and building high-functioning teams, large and small. She is the founder and principal of All Access Health LLC, which works to improve health and well-being around the globe, which an organization that advises public, private, and nonprofit clients on effective partnerships to drive health system innovation, drive results, and improve value for spending. Prior to that, she was an Associate Vice President of Global Enterprise Policy for Merck & Company and also the Senior Executive Director for Vaccine Global Public Policy. Before joining Merck, Lydia worked at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention for 23 years in a variety of capacities, including serving as Director for the Office of Health Reform. So we'll begin our session with allowing each of our guests to set the stage with respect to some background information. Marian will help us by providing an overview of the current candidate vaccines for COVID-19. She'll describe the general process for bringing a vaccine from bench to market and give us that perspective with the lens of developing vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. Lydia will then follow and give us an overview of the practical aspects of manufacturing vaccines, the distribution process globally, and the unique challenges that this worldwide pandemic poses for global vaccine distribution and ultimately global equity. So Marian, why don't you go ahead and get us started? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Esther. I really appreciate that. And it occurred to me when I was giving you my bio that I should also indicate that I do sit on the Dornsife Advisory Council to the Dean there at Drexel. So I get very involved in Drexel activities, and I'm thrilled to be a part of the Drexel action. I've been getting, as you can imagine, because I've been in vaccines for so much of my career, while Management Sciences for Health focuses on immunization more than anything else, I've been getting lots and lots of vaccine development questions. And I think generally when people ask, when are we going to have a vaccine, what they really want to know is, when can I get back to a normal life? And of course, to get back to a really normal life, depending on what this world looks like as we get through this pandemic, it implies that we have a vaccine that it works well enough, is safe enough, and can be distributed across large enough populations to break the transmission cycle of the disease and make it safe to interact more normally. Many experts, including Dr. Anthony Fauci at the NIH and others, say it will be 12 to 18 months at least. And honestly, based on what I know of vaccine development and my experience nurturing vaccines through their life cycle, I would lean on those two words, at least. And I wanted to give folks an idea about why. The normal vaccine development process, I pulled a paper actually just to make sure that I was right, takes at least 10 years. And in my personal experience, actually, is not uncommon for a vaccine to take up to 20 years. And to understand why, first you have to understand what it takes to even make what you think might be a vaccine. There are a number of different strategies for making a vaccine, but vaccines are generally either, I'm simplifying a little bit, but proteins, which means there's some aspect of the pathogen, the enemy virus that you're trying to teach your immune system to defend against, or they're a killed or attenuated version of the virus. There's more variations. I am simplifying, but roughly speaking, they're one of those two things a lot of the time. And so if they're a whole virus, then you need to make sure that they don't and cannot replicate in humans. And if they're a protein of other sorts, then you need to develop a system to consistently make the protein. And you have to make sure that you're not doing it with too many extra components that might cause either have no benefit or even carry some unknown risk. With luck, that development stage, depending on the work, might take as little as a year. It often takes longer. Once you have something that a researcher would call a vaccine candidate, then you do preclinical testing in animals, and you're looking for several things at that stage. Is the vaccine safe? Does it cause the immune response you want? And does it avoid the immune responses that you don't want? And does it do anything else in the bodies of the animals that you studied that would give you a clue that you have to look for certain kinds of safety signals when you go into humans? At the same time that you're looking at all that biology, you're still working on how you make it and making sure that the batches that you make for testing are reproducible so that as you scale to larger populations, you're able to make the same product. That's preclinical. Your phase 1 studies are going to start with dosing one person at a time and looking for ill effects in a carefully controlled setting. And you have to be careful about this because animals don't tell you everything about what's going to happen in humans, and we need to protect those healthy human beings that are in the first-in-human studies. With enough experience and with enough subjects, you move into larger phase 2 studies. And then you have a chance to see the immune responses. You have enough data so that you can understand the immune responses that you're seeing, and you'll start to get a sense for what the most frequent side effects are likely to be. You also, at this stage, might be looking at a few different doses of the vaccine. From there, phase 3 trials are where you get your real measures of efficacy, and those are generally for vaccines, for preventative vaccines. Those are generally thousands of people, and they usually have a placebo arm or some kind of control arm, and they take many months to perform depending on a lot of things with respect to the epidemiology, study size, the endpoints you want to look at. So what I just described, preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, is at least 10 years. A year or two for development and preclinical, 2.5 years for each of phase 1, 2, and 3, and a little over a year for regulatory review, and that gets you to a commercial vaccine if all goes well. But of course, in this 10-year timeline, I'm mostly assuming that everything works. Studies actually show that at the preclinical stage, a vaccine has a 1 in 10 shot of actually making it to market. And by the time it gets to phase 2, it's still only 1 in 4. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And a lot of reasons that there's a lot of uncertainty is because we start with with looking in test tubes and on petri dishes if we can, and then we look in animals. But animals, and even the best animal models, are very limited in their ability to ultimately predict vaccine efficacy and safety. That means trials have to go slowly when they get into humans, and that means it's very hard to predict what will happen. In this environment with a pandemic going on, where people are dying at extraordinary rates, I do think that regulators will shorten some of the review timelines. I think they already have. They'll look to do things like do some of the analysis and the trials in parallel rather than doing them in series, one after another. But the basic principle, the basic ethics of this still will be that the benefits must outweigh the risks, and the estimates of the risk must be based on good science. All of that still needs to apply. So there's only so much time they can shorten. There is very good news. There is one actually shortcut that the government can take, and Lydia may suggest a few more, and that is that both the US government, the WHO, and a number of other bodies have established guidelines for emergency use. That means select at-risk populations. Imagine healthcare workers, people in outbreak hotspots, may be able to use the vaccine before regulatory approval. And some of these later stage phase 3 trials may get very, very large to incorporate a fair number of high-risk people. So the vaccine can have benefit early. But again, that has to be done carefully, and it has to be done in alignment with regulatory authorities. So I'm pretty sure that Anthony Fauci is right that the earliest could be 12 to 18 months. But I also know that it's going to take a lot of cooperation to take what is normally more like a 10-year timeline and collapse it into that short period of time. Now, there's one aspect of risk that's really specific to this coronavirus, to COVID-19, that I'd like to highlight for a minute. And that is a really big issue that's called, in our world, immunopathology. And immunopathology is the bad things that can happen from your body's own response to a pathogen, to an enemy virus. In this case, the COVID-19, or the formal name for the virus, SARS-CoV-2, the current virus that causes our pandemic. Part of the damage that they cause is actually from our body's own response to that virus. We know we have responses that kill the virus because many of us ultimately actually recover from it and clear it. But we also have responses that promote the viral infection, and we have immune responses that actually enhance the damaging inflammatory effects, particularly in lung tissue. And that means that if the point of a vaccine is to teach our immune system how to mount a response to SARS-CoV-2, then we need to make sure we're not also teaching our immune system to make the infection worse, or to cause the same symptoms we would have had if we had actually been infected with the virus. So while scientists are getting very excited about some of the animal models they're looking at, some of the in vitro studies they're doing, and how fast they can use some of these new technologies and their new platforms to get into people, these effects need to be looked at quite carefully and quite closely. There's one more large time-consuming issue that I'm not going to get into in detail because the solutions are so specific to the vaccines and the vaccine platform that we're talking about. But we do need, in general, very large manufacturing plants to make the number of doses that we think the world might need, and also to bring the cost down to something that the world can afford. Commercial safe manufacturing plants generally take years to build and validate, and a lot of capital to invest. So even if we can compress the timelines on many fronts, most scientists with very optimistic timelines are talking about the first people that will get the doses, and not those that are last in line. For that, it's going to take a long time. So that's a little bit of a negative, perhaps. So Lydia, I'm hoping you can make it a little bit more cheerful.
Thank you. I'm not sure I can make it that much more cheerful, but thanks, Marian, and thanks, Esther. It's really exciting to be on this webinar today. What I'm going to talk about is what a normal vaccine rollout looks like, and then what one looks like in an epidemic or an outbreak, and then some political considerations. So Marian, as Marian mentioned, typical large-scale phase 3 clinical trials are very costly and very time-consuming. To be licensed, stringent regulatory authorities like FDA here in the US and the European Medicines Agency in Europe, or EMA as it's called, have to approve the process for vaccine manufacture, the plant itself, and even the staff who make the vaccine, not just the product. And importantly, at least in a normal situation, approval by FDA does not guarantee approval by those other authorities. So even though FDA and EMA have a mutual recognition agreement, as it's called, vaccines are explicitly excluded from that right now. Beyond those stringent regulatory authorities, the WHO also pre-qualifies vaccines, and that allows UN agencies like UNICEF to purchase them on behalf of various countries. But that doesn't substitute for local licensure of a vaccine. To legally sell a vaccine, it must be registered and licensed by every government in every country where it will be used. So that presents some problems because the scientific expertise needed to make a vaccine is very stringent, as Marian laid out for us, but so is the expertise needed to evaluate the safety and the efficacy of vaccines. And many of these NRAs, as they're called, National Regulatory Authorities, are of variable capacity, particularly in low and lower middle income countries. So, and another important hurdle for a typical vaccine is that there's nothing akin to a global label. Products packaged for use in country A cannot typically be moved to country B if they need to be reallocated because there's an outbreak or something like that, without repackaging them, which again costs time and money and potentially lives. So that's a little overview of the typical regulatory set of challenges. Once, though, you have a licensed vaccine, there are a series of recommending bodies, those groups like the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices here in the US, it's called ACIP, which these groups of scientific experts conduct a rigorous evaluation of the risks and benefits of a vaccine, including cost-benefit analysis, and they make specific recommendations for use in specific populations on a specific schedule in a specific country. So the ACIP recommendations don't have any weight other than sort of the force of scientific authority in any other country. The global analog to ACIP is SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Committee on SAGE. I always forget what the GE stands for. So SAGE is the global body, but again, just like with the regulatory authorities, every nation has its own National Immunization Technical Advisory Group, or NITAG. And just like the local regulatory authorities, they also vary in their capacity and their ability to make informed and most particularly timely recommendations for use. Beyond that, there's the issue of pharmacovigilance systems. So once a vaccine is licensed by a regulatory authority, recommended by a recommending authority, then what you need is a set of systems that will detect any problems when that vaccine comes into use. The US has one of the most robust, if not the most robust systems to capture signals of any kinds of problems that can result from immunization, whether that's adverse events like beyond, your arm hurting or running a fever, but potentially a serious adverse event, or critically, if a vaccine is for some reason underperforming, that if we're seeing breakthroughs of illness or something like that. Other high-income countries have similarly robust systems, but as you might expect, in low and middle-income countries, these surveillance systems are highly variable, and the quality of their data, the timeliness, the completeness, the accuracy may be insufficient to send up a flare. And so that is anxiety-provoking for manufacturers and regulators and recommenders and public health systems, because then you won't know if there's a problem in use. The other issue I want to raise is one of health budgets. In the United States, for example, the CDC is the single largest purchaser of vaccines. And that budget comes to CDC automatically from CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. In other countries, though, in particularly in low and lower middle income countries, immunization programs compete against not only other health interventions, maternal child health, let's say, but against other sectors like education and infrastructure. And the tough decision that governments have to make is you can either cut spending somewhere else, and that's somewhere else has its needs and its advocates and its beneficiaries, or you can increase revenue through taxes or fees, but it is a zero-sum game. If money is going to immunization, it's not going somewhere else. The other problem is that budgets are typically developed annually, even though immunization programs are sort of in perpetuity. And with enough advance warning, if a new vaccine is coming, officials can plan on the funding that will be needed. But challenges are in a situation like this, when you have something unexpected hitting your budget, that means money will definitely be cut from somewhere else to devote to the immunization program, unless, of course, funders like foundations and others step up to provide funding. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Another challenge with budgeting is that there are typically, as I said, year-to-year funding cycles as opposed to multi-year cycles. Anti-corruption policies that have been put in place with very good intent can sometimes thwart the use of the best vaccine needed for a given population, because laws often require that the bid must go to the lowest bidder if a product is deemed equivalent, even if they aren't really equivalent in practical use. So good intent, potentially unintended outcomes. For very low income countries, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, provides support for their immunization programs, not just support for the product, but also for the people needed to procure that product, for the storage of the product, for delivery of the product, including vaccinators, and critically public education programs to help people understand why they need to vaccinate themselves or their children. The middle income countries lack that support from Gavi, and they don't have sufficient budgets themselves. And this is why we often see vaccination lagging in that group, in that economic group. And that's a particular concern for me as we think about this vaccine. So as I said, I'm going to talk briefly about what a vaccine rollout looks like in an emergency. And I'll just say that almost none of what I just talked about happens, or it happens concurrently, as Marian mentioned, as opposed to consecutively. And we can and do deliver vaccines under emergency use authorization. As Marian mentioned, we did that with Ebola. Doing so means that you do it under a clinical trial protocol. And that imposes challenges for ramping up delivery at a very wide scale. And it also requires that ethical review bodies, as you do with any research study, have to be, pulled together in every single country. They have to review the protocol and say, this is okay. And just like regulatory authorities, just like recommending bodies, those ethical review bodies are variable in their ability to come together quickly, make decisions quickly, and implement quickly. So beyond that, if we think about implementing ethically under an established protocol, that can pose challenges in terms of responding rapidly and doing things that are required under the 4 ethical principles of respect and autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, because that just takes time to do and do properly. And it's really important, but that's in tension with getting people vaccinated quickly. In the case of a global rollout, as opposed to what we did with Ebola, there will have to be some system of rational allocation for who gets limited doses. Because even if we built the capacity to do global manufacturing, if we could wave a magic wand and build it tomorrow, all the doses aren't going to come off the line tomorrow. So there's going to have to be some ethical assessment of who gets a limited quantity of vaccine. And in the current environment, that's not just an ethical question, but it's a political question. So just as we're seeing with different approaches to ventilator allocation, the absence of any overarching global or even national guidelines means that jurisdictions and even specific hospital systems in the US are developing their own approaches. And that just raises a whole lot of ethical, legal, and political concerns. So finally, about the political questions, there are a lot. And two of the most vexing are who pays? That's the biggest elephant in the room. And you know, will the funders that are paying move to nationalize manufacturing of their vaccines, even those vaccines that are developed with a global nonprofit like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation? If CEPI, as it's known, if their vaccines are developed by a company in a particular jurisdiction, like the US or another country, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that if this goes on and even worsens, that those countries that are funders would opt to say, okay, now we've paid for this vaccine, we're going to keep it for our people. And they may not see it in their enlightened self-interest to understand that their populations are only as healthy as people around the world are healthy. So I'll just stop there and invite the questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for that really informative, comprehensive background. I think the world of vaccine development for most people is not well understood. So that's a great frame of reference and great background. We're open for questions now. We'll let the audience submit them, but while that's happening, I'll get us started. You both alluded to the Ebola experience, and I'm wondering, I suspect that there's lots of folks who don't fully understand what happened with Ebola, and I know that a number of articles published recently talk about ways to expedite bringing a vaccine to use in humans while the studies are still happening. And one of the things that has been proposed is bringing a vaccine through the research protocols through, say, phase 2A, and then allowing phase 3 trials to actually happen in the context of pandemic response. And one example of how that might have been done was the Ebola Sasufi trial. So perhaps what you could share with us maybe how Ebola was a model for that, and whether that's the kind of thing that could happen here in terms of accelerating access to a vaccine product.
Marian, do you want to start and then I'll chime in?
Yeah, and I'll try and stick to kind of the lines that we've drawn a little bit. One thing actually that's really important to know about Ebola is that there were already several vaccine candidates ready to go into human beings when the 2014 outbreak occurred. And so the question was really, how do we get it into phase 2 and into phase 3? We were quite lucky because we were able to study 3 at the same time and figure out one that works. So I want to use that to remind you that, and actually the other 2 did not work. That's a lot of negatives, but there were questions of scale and, you know, other kinds of practical questions that also went into those calculations. So one prevailed by the end. But all of that work was done initially under protocols in different jurisdictions. And that created some complexity, which I will hand over to Lydia.
Yes, so the things that I talked about the need for different ethical review bodies to review a protocol, that happened with Merck's Ebola vaccine as well as GSK's and Janssen's vaccine. And one of the lessons we learned is there a way that we can work with likely to be affected countries to pre-approve protocols so that that process could move faster and we could get into the field faster? But even by short-circuiting that, and I don't mean short-circuiting by missing the step, but just shortening that time, there's still a challenge of implementing a mass vaccination program under a clinical trial protocol. One of those things moves very quickly and one of those things moves appropriately very slowly. So we just have to figure out ways that we can do this, not miss any of the ethical steps, not short circuit the protocol, but yet move very quickly, particularly with such a lethal pathogen like Ebola.
Can I just throw one more thing in there? The emergency use authorization document that WHO works under now was basically written based on the learnings of the 2014 Ebola experience. And so I think we have actually, as a global community, taken our best learnings from that experience. Now we're testing them, though, in a completely different environment.
So there was a question from an audience member. What are the implications about the Gates Foundation spending billions to bring a vaccine to market? And does a non-governmental funding source offer a new avenue or possible avenue to vaccine production that would at least might be faster than looking for, say, traditional or governmental funding sources?
Okay, I can take that one for a couple of minutes. First of all, in terms of vaccine funding, funding sources in the early stages come from governments, come from all sorts of, from nonprofits, from a number of different sources. And Gates has been involved in funding vaccines development as well for a long time. The organization CEPI that Lydia was talking about is actually invested in a series of very early stage vaccine systems, basically to get ready for some kind of pandemic. They worry about both pandemic influenza and disease X, that other big pandemic that I think is kind of here. I think we have our disease X. We just named it COVID-19. But then there's still a big job in terms of translation, of getting that to scale, and of studying and understanding what it means in very large populations. And yes, Bill Gates and CEPI are extremely instrumental. Bill Gates just said a couple nights ago that he's going to invest in manufacturing plants for 7 different vaccines in the hopes of getting 2. CEPI is trying to raise money for at least $2 billion to make sure that as many vaccine programs are in place as possible, so that they're hoping for 3. So right now they have investments in 8 in order to get 3. And the CEO now is talking about also pre-positioning money to build plants that we might never need in order to make sure that we have vaccines as soon as possible. So that's not a regulatory shortcut, that's an investment shortcut. That's a willingness to lose maybe billions of dollars in order to save millions of lives and trillions of dollars.
Yeah, and I think an important point to make is that although governments fund early stages, as Marian just said, so maybe up to phase 2A or 2B, typically for most commercialized vaccines, those very large and costly phase 3 trials are borne by the manufacturer. So that is investment at risk. And so this may be an opportunity to change that paradigm, recognizing that in some parts of the world, this vaccine won't be quote unquote commercial. Although in high income countries, provided we do get a successful candidate or more than one ideally, it could well be a commercial vaccine. So, this is novel for all of us.
New world, thank you. There's a question around allocation and so-called rationing supplies. Lydia, you brought that up earlier. The question is, there won't be enough supply for everyone once the vaccine is available. What role could or should the federal government play in the rationing or distribution process? And how do we manage what we're seeing now in terms of states competing with each other for necessary supplies? I guess I could think of this in 2 ways. One is, how do you see this happening? And in the ideal world, how would you like to see it happen with respect to a rational approach to allocation?
Well, I think it's very concerning what we're seeing now with states and even hospital systems competing against each other in the marketplace for masks and gloves and other PPE and ventilators. So ideally, what you would want is the supplementary materials from the Strategic National Stockpile to be provided to hotspots as those crop up in some kind of rational way. vaccine, obviously we don't have any of that in the strategic national stockpile just yet. And, I think the worst possible outcome would be to have 50 plus states and jurisdictions, along with sub-jurisdictions, going out and competing against each other to purchase a vaccine or vaccines. That's the worst possible outcome. So my recommendation would be that the federal government be the purchaser and then be the allocator based on some rational set of guidelines.
And how about a global platform? Marian, would you want to take that on? Do we hope that the pandemic is in different places in different times of the year so that we don't have to pit country against country?
Oh, well, I think we're past hoping that, just based on looking at maps right now. Honestly, there are a lot of people hoping this is seasonal, this is whatever. Once we start getting some population immunity, there will be a lumpiness, perhaps, that's not a technical term, for how we see outbreaks, but we can't hope for a nice, way to level the demand across, which is actually a huge challenge, because honestly, once we have a vaccine, what we really want to do is to vaccinate, billions of people. And then on a yearly basis, you want basically a couple 100 million to vaccinate the new people who are born. I mean, that's how you'd actually want to do it. And that's kind of an impossible calculus. And we've wrestled with that in the vaccines world for years. The jurisdiction, we don't have an overriding public health authority with jurisdiction. And the WHO can't give orders to governments. They can set model policies, and many governments follow them. And the WHO is the closest we have, really, to the kind of body that you would want doing that sort of thing. The other thing that you have to remember is, regardless of how many institutions or groups were funding the vaccine development, how many different scientists were working across borders beautifully, and by the way, the collaboration I've seen these days is extraordinary. I've had a chance to review vaccine development programs in detail, and it's the United Nations on every application proposal, sharing information earlier than I could possibly imagine. So that is wonderful. But the manufacturer who actually has the doses in the vial or box or bottle or whatever is going to sit in a country. Hopefully we'll have more programs. Hopefully we will transfer the technology so that that's not, an imbalance for too long. But the fact of the matter is, on day one, dose one, it's sitting in a jurisdiction that's going to matter. And so I'd like to see strong coalitions of international organizations, certainly WHO, Gavi, and a series of civil society organizations and so forth, all got together during Ebola to figure out what they thought was the right thing across this myriad of difficult issues. And they brought in scientific advisors, et cetera. I'd like to see, frankly, I'd like to see the WHO actually be the authority here, because I think they have the right convening power and the right expertise. But realistically, I'm not sure that that's how that's going to happen.
Well, and that would typically be the role for SAGE, the advisory group of experts that I mentioned earlier. Group of experts being the G and the E that I forgot. So that's what you would do for a typical vaccine. I think, as we've seen though this week, there's some politicization of the WHO going on, not just in the US, but in other jurisdictions. And, Marian's point that WHO is a normative body. It is not an authority. It cannot regulate, it cannot force, it cannot enforce. So, collectively, like it or not, we have the WHO that we want, right? May not be what all of us in public health want, but it's what governmental authorities want, because they don't want a supranational body swooping in to tell them what they can and can't do in their own country.
And I might add, in the world of vaccines, that issue is, even in the European Union, which has harmonized so many things, you have different vaccine schedules for different countries in Europe. And even within some countries in Europe, you have different vaccine schedules for different states or regions. So vaccination ends up being a very personal, if you will, kind of decision. We don't give up our sovereignty very quickly on that one.
So related to this conversation, there's a question around importance really of public communication around vaccines and how that might play out with COVID-19 vaccine. Who will lead it? Will vaccine hesitancy be an issue? There's always issues around rumors when it comes to vaccine campaigns to control epidemics. How should that be addressed? Thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, Lydia is looking at me because she knows that this is a soapbox for me. A lot of my career has been in marketing, and I know that, you know, it's a fundamental fact of human nature that we like to deny that we're at risk. Right now we can't because the pandemic is so imminent, but some people can. You know, we've seen folks on beaches. We are looking for a reason to believe that any kind of message that causes us to do something doesn't apply to us. Turns out not to be just adolescents. We do this through our whole life. We just do it differently as we get older. During the H1N1 crisis in the United States in 2009, you actually saw a whole series of mixed messages. As the vaccine started to come out, and you know, I was living in the Philadelphia area, so in Bucks County, so I had messages coming from Philadelphia Department of Health, from Pennsylvania Department of Health, New Jersey Department of Health, because that's not very far from where I am, and also from Bucks County. Those doses were delivered to different, when we had limited doses, they were delivered to different populations in each of those jurisdictions. You know, some were focused on children, some were focused on high-risk adults, elderly. You know, they were making very different choices. But when you sit in one media market like Philadelphia, you hear all those different messages. And that makes it very, very easy for people to feel like the vaccine doesn't apply to them. Those mixed messages are a huge, huge cost. If we had had a consistent message saying everyone who is in this category should be getting it, I think we would have had much faster uptake of those doses. We were worried about running out, and that didn't happen at the beginning in this market. And it didn't happen because we had mixed messages. So it's just like, how do we line up in order to allocate doses? That same question also says, how do we set a standard for clean, clear communication? We've started to gravitate around social distancing messages, but just think back 2 or 3 weeks, we had different messages coming from different places about what even social distancing meant. And that meant that there were a bunch of folks who took a long time to line up.
Yeah, and I'll just add that a physician colleague of mine who's done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa sent me a set of messages from actually a message board for physicians in sub-Saharan Africa. And there were some very disturbing rumors being passed around among physicians, including one, you know, apparently promulgated by the French doctor who has been so adamant around hydroxychloroquine that, you know, Africans should not be the guinea pigs for this vaccine. Don't take this vaccine. It's not good for Africans, you know, and of course this is layered on to pre-existing rumors around vaccines being a means to sterilize young African women. This was HPV vaccine and other rumors like that. And what I would say is that whether you're sitting in the US or you're sitting in Malawi or you're sitting in France, the trust in a vaccine, any given vaccine, is really a proxy for your trust in your government, the trust in the system that regulates the creation of that vaccine, in manufacturers' motivations, and in your particular doctor's competency and motivation, if a doctor is giving you that vaccine. And as we've seen in many, many other areas, there's just a tremendous erosion of trust in institutions and government in particular, not just in the US. And so I suspect that if and when we do have a vaccine or more than one vaccine, there will be people who will resist taking it.
It's a tough challenge. It's a very tough challenge. Like the information around the disease balanced with the correct information around the vaccine and the prevention mechanism. There's a question around patents, and how likely is it that the eventual vaccine will be patented and then turned into a commodity rather than global shared knowledge? And I would imagine an extension of this question is we might envision a time where there's multiple vaccines and competition in a marketplace. What are your thoughts about that?
So the patents are really, really an important consideration for drugs. And they're a very nuanced consideration for vaccines. What's most important about a vaccine is knowing how to make it, consistently, and having demonstrated in the clinic that what you made has the effect that you want. That is, you pretty much have a match between the clinical trials that showed efficacy and safety and a manufacturing plan. And whether or not the product is on patent, it's very difficult to duplicate that. If you start a new manufacturing plant and you make the product even in, you think, the same way, it is very difficult to show that it's the same product. It's very different when you're talking about medicines and tablets. Those things that are chemicals or small molecules, we sometimes call them because they're not proteins. You can show chemical equivalents, and then you can put them into human bodies and show that it gets to the kidney, the liver, and so forth in the same way, that the kinetics are the same. And that will take you a very short period of time, and then you can start making the product. So patents matter a great deal for duplicating drugs. But for vaccines, patents are much more left to the space of inventors and freedom to operate and so forth. I would put my neck out on the line and say that if somebody had a patent that interfered with somebody's manufacturing process, that they probably really would not want to be in the papers saying that they stopped somebody from making something because they hold an important patent. So I don't think that patents are actually going to be our block. I think what's going to be our block is teaching people how to make it and how to make it well. And that takes a considerable investment. So even with very, very liberal approaches, you can't do that fast or in too many places.
Yeah, that Marian's alluded to something that is a really important consideration here, which is the issue of technology transfer. And even with a quote unquote simple, that is non-multivalent, one pathogen or one strain vaccine, the complexities associated with creating and making consistently, et cetera, that she's talked about are made that much more difficult with a novel process. So some of the candidates going through trials now are proposing new and as yet unlicensed processes or platforms. So being able to successfully transfer that technology to myriad contract manufacturing partners to successfully make and consistently make massive doses of vaccine will just be very, very challenging. And the other thing is that it's not one patent typically with a vaccine. It can be as many as 50 or 100 because it's little pieces or little processes. And so, you know, some of those little pieces or processes will be proprietary technology that the manufacturer is using for other commercial products. So that just takes time to figure out. But I agree with Marian, there's going to be tremendous pressure for this to be pooled knowledge and pooled technology. And I think we'll see as the candidates progress, how many, if any, multinational companies are willing to step up, other than Janssen, as they have done J&J, to progress a candidate through, knowing the risk that it will be considered a public good.
You each talked about the risk in the world of vaccine development and how few candidate vaccines eventually really are shown to be successful and make it to market. What's the best way to ramp up the manufacturing capacity for multiple vaccines if the lion's share of those vaccines aren't going to be successful? Is it a government responsibility to try to shore up those companies so they're willing to take the risk? And there's a history of this where companies have lost a lot of money putting their factories on the line, putting their money on the line, their R&D on the line. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh boy.
I know it was a tough one.
Yeah, no, I'm privy to, how much money Merck actually put on the line to scale up the Ebola vaccine just to the small number of doses. And it was both a matter of investing in specifically that vaccine, but also putting other vaccine development on hold. And that's not just a money cost, that's a cost in terms of other diseases that we could have commercial vaccines for now that perhaps are delayed by 1, 2, or even more years. So I think these questions are actually business questions, but they're also, ethical and impact questions, and they're very, very serious questions. So I'm really thrilled if Bill Gates says he's going to invest in 7, manufacturing plants, but I do wonder whether that is merely a cost for the foundation. In addition to the capital expenditure, you have all kinds of specialized scientists that you need. Mm-hmm. These things are not easy to make. I think it's the right thing to do right at the moment, but I don't think it's an easy thing to do.
Right. And I'll just add, the US government has 2 vaccine production facilities that are sort of in mothballs. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind that was that they would be, ever ready. Warm basing is what's known as in the industry. But given some of the newer platforms and newer technologies that are in development now, and these are older style manufacturing facilities, they may not work to produce them. So this is a really critical question. A commercial vaccine manufacturer has borrowed money from people. Those people are called shareholders, and they expect to get their money back with a profit. And so, when you lose money on a vaccine candidate that doesn't work, or when the call comes and then the pathogen fizzles out, like, SARS did, then, your shareholders quite rightly kind of say, well, wait a minute, why did you do that with my money? So it's a complicated question.
So there's a few technical questions here. One of them is about the efficacy of BCG. That's been in the news in the last few weeks. Any thoughts about BCG?
Not from me.
I mean, so people are getting excited about some of these things. BCG is a preventative for tuberculosis, and that's most frequently symptomatic in the lungs. So there's that. And there seems to be a correlation between some countries that are that still routinely use BCG and where the outbreak is happening. It's a very, very loose correlation. And I just read a document that was just published in the last day or 2, and they included, 4 or 5 countries, and one of them was Japan. And now the news is that Japan has outbreaks heating up, which I'm sorry, Esther, is,
No, one of my sons is there, full disclosure.
And so my point is, anybody who's taken a stats class knows that if you, look at 20 experiments, one will show some statistical significance, regardless of whether there is any kind of correlation. And that's kind of what we're doing right at the moment. That's what we're doing with a number of the treatments that we're looking at too. We're observing and we're thinking we might see something. And the problem is it's really important to know, because we can't put people at risk who are otherwise completely healthy in the hopes that something works. And that's where I am with BCG. That's where I am with some of the other drugs that are meant, especially the ones to treat lung diseases. Just because the symptoms are in the lungs doesn't mean that the cause is the same.
Agreed. So thank you for that. We have 3 minutes left, and I think maybe what we could do is ask each of you if you want to have make any sort of closing remarks, or what's the one thing that you would want the audience to be left with respect to vaccines and COVID-19 in terms of what we have to look forward to in the next 12 months.
Okay. Well, I've said how long it takes for a vaccine to develop and how amazing it is, the kinds of compression that regulators, international organizations, and scientists are trying to achieve. I think we should be extremely grateful for the level of effort that's being put in. So I'm not saying be complacent and, 12 to 18 months is good enough. What I'm saying is be appreciative of the hard work that not only people on the front lines are doing to combat the disease right now, but people in the labs are doing to combat the disease right now. There's a tremendous, tremendous alignment of effort across countries that otherwise don't like each other very much at all. But what we should be doing, the rest of us who are not involved in vaccine development, is lining the rest of our ducks in a row, expecting some kind of coordination of prioritization, expecting some kind of coordination of messaging, et cetera. We should be lobbying now for the strength and leadership to manage what we hope will get us to the end. Thank you.
Lydia, do you want to add to that?
So I think, people, as Marian said to start us off, people pin their hopes on a vaccine because they're pinning their hopes on getting back to normal. And I think we all want that to happen as soon as possible, and there will be tremendous pressure to let our foot off the gas as cases subside. And from a public health standpoint, I'm very fearful that we will do that and see another uptick in cases. I think we just have to get used to, this is going to be our reality for a while until hopefully we do have vaccines available and people take them. And we've come so far at lightning speed. I'm hoping we'll be able to continue the same pace.
Thank you. Well, we're at 5 o'clock. Thanks to both of you for a really terrific webinar. I think we learned so much, and it was great to have both of you share your expertise with us. I just want to remind the audience that if you want to download an archive of this webinar and see future webinars, you can go to the Dornsife School of Public Health website. It's www.drexel.edu/Dornsife. And with that, well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.